A 46-year-old black man, George Floyd, dies under the knee of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Mass outrage quickly ensued, with racial riots engulfing cities throughout the nation. Metropolitan police across the country suddenly found themselves the target of protester and politician alike, as both demanded their defunding and dissolution. City councils and mayors together joined in the protest, abdicating their law enforcement responsibilities, allowing the riots to go on largely unabated. In the midst of the ash and destruction, there emerged bands of armed citizens, many of whom were members of patriot militias, standing in the gap, working together with police and law enforcement to defend their families and neighborhoods from the encroaching chaos. But for the mainstream media, which unabashedly championed the rise of Black Lives Matter and the riots that ravaged our cities, these armed militias became synonymous with racism, vigilantism, and white supremacism, everything that the so-called social justice warriors were rioting against. And yet, what the media all too willingly overlooked is that the surge in patriot militias represents nothing less than the rise of a new political order, one that promises to redefine our world for the foreseeable future, and one that is only just beginning.
I'm prepared for civil war, civil unrest, EMP attack from North Korea, Russia, invasion from a foreign government, my own government turning its guns against the people in an effort to disarm.
These are the members of what are called the 3% militia. They derive their name from the notion that only 3% of colonists fought in the Revolutionary War, but were still able to overwhelm and defeat the British Empire, the major superpower of the time. The 3%ers are part of a massive nationwide militia movement whose membership has been surging for the last decade. Today, there are over 500 militia groups in the United States, more than double the number in 2008. Contrary to their portrayal in the mainstream news media, America's militias hardly resemble the racial monolith of white supremacist organizations. Like the broader gun enthusiast culture, patriot militia groups are comprised of an ethnically and socially diverse coalition of citizens united by a common concern over the safety and welfare of their families, their communities, and their nation. Their strong commitment to faith, family, and freedom inescapably connects militias to local communities, connections which include a growing alliance with law enforcement. Both national organizations and smaller statewide militias recruit heavily from current and former law enforcement as well as military personnel who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Thousands of active and retired law enforcement officers have joined militia organizations over the last few years, and many believe this number is currently swelling given how leftist lawmakers were so quick to disavow the police with their defund and disband rhetoric. As armed militias were known for their outspoken anti-government stance during the Clinton and Obama administrations, this alliance between law enforcement and militia members has caught the mainstream media by surprise. The Washington Post complained that police were refusing to control armed militias, largely because law enforcement actually welcomed their assistance in response to BLM protests. Some in the media went further, suggesting that militias and law enforcement were becoming indistinguishable. The Guardian ran the rather panicked and sensationalist headline, "White supremacists and militias have infiltrated police." Racist rhetoric and sensationalism aside, think tanks like the Brookings Institute observe that this alliance between patriot militias and law enforcement is resulting in militias playing an increasingly prominent role in American society and politics. From leading protests and demonstrations around COVID-19 restrictions to working together with law enforcement to help protect businesses during the height of BLM protests, militia presence at public events is becoming more and more widespread. Not only are members of militias participating in more civic events, they're also beginning to win elected office, particularly members of the Oath Keepers. One of the largest patriot groups in the nation, the Oath Keepers were formed in 2009, and many of their members were indeed current and former police officers as well as military personnel. Today in Hood County, Texas, just outside of Fort Worth, several Oath Keepers hold office, including the town constable. So, what's really behind this surge in patriot militias? This rapprochement between patriots and police actually points to a larger political realignment in what scholars call populism. The paradigm that increasingly defines our politics is no longer organized around a partisan animosity between Democrats and Republicans or the ideological designations of conservative versus liberal. Instead, the increasingly dominant political paradigm of our age is one organized around the animosity between the people versus the political class, the ruled versus their rulers, ordinary Americans versus oligarchs. What characterizes populists is a deep-seated suspicion, indeed a radical hostility towards our elite class, our permanent political, corporate, and media elite, who are seen as ruling for their own benefit according to their own values, interests, and concerns, which are increasingly hostile to the values, interests, and concerns of the people. Populists are united by the belief that the customs, cultures, and traditions that define a people are best preserved when taken out of the hands of the ruling elite and placed back in the hands of ordinary citizens. In 2010, pollsters Scott Rasmussen and Doug Schoen published their study on the burgeoning Tea Party movement entitled Mad as Hell. The authors found substantial data that showed that there was in fact a major paradigm shift taking place among the American electorate, where the old political divides between left and right and liberal versus conservative were dying away, and a new political divide between the people versus the ruling class, the ruled versus the rulers, was emerging. Overseas, comparable dynamics were operative in the victory of Brexit, where more Brits voted to leave the European Union than had ever voted for a political party in Britain's history. And the election of Donald Trump a few months later solidified the fact that this new politics was quite literally changing the worldwide political order. And so, as Democrat city councils were busy throwing law enforcement under the bus, they unknowingly contributed to the political and regional realignment of our nation. As BLM and Antifa radicals began occupying our municipalities and urban areas, armed citizens and law enforcement joined forces in defense of our suburbs and exurbs as part of a new populist uprising. The surge in patriot militias, like the rise of Brexit and Trump, is a further indicator that a new political order is rising in our nation. This political realignment is in effect forming new coalitions, new alliances, where otherwise antithetically hostile groups such as our militias and law enforcement are banding together in defense of faith, family, and freedom. The surge in patriot militias signals a surging populist movement that in many respects is only just beginning. It does appear that patriot militias are indeed here to stay.